How Portugal took Macau from China with only 3 ships. Part 1. Did you know that a nation the size of Maine managed to establish a colony in China that lasted 442 years? That it did so with fewer ships than Columbus used to discover America? That this colony survived the fall of empires, world wars, communist revolutions, and wasn't returned until 1999, decades after the Portuguese Empire itself had collapsed? How is it possible that Portugal, a small nation on the edge of Europe with a population smaller than an average Chinese province, managed to plant its flag on Chinese territory and keep it there for over 4 centuries? And here's the most unsettling question. Did Portugal really take Macau? Or was it China that, for complex and cynical reasons, allowed them to stay? Because when you examine the details, you discover something fascinating. This was not a military conquest in the style of Portuguese conquests in Goa or Malacca. There was no massive battle, no prolonged siege, no epic bloodshed. Instead, it was a gradual infiltration, an ambiguous occupation where the Portuguese were never completely sure if they were temporary tenants or permanent rulers. And the Chinese never fully recognized their sovereignty, but also never expelled them. It was one of the strangest colonial relationships in history, and it began in 1513 when 3 small Portuguese ships sailed into Chinese waters carrying bearded merchants, noisy arquebuses, and ambitions that far exceeded their numbers. This is the story of how those 3 ships became an enclave that would outlive the dynasty that granted it, that would see communism rise and fall in China, and that would finally be returned not because Portugal was strong enough to keep it, but because China finally decided it was time to reclaim what it had always considered its own. To understand how Portugal established Macau, we need to go back to the exact moment when the Portuguese first arrived in Chinese waters, because that first encounter set the pattern for everything that would come after. Mutual misunderstandings, incompatible objectives, and a willingness by both sides to pretend the arrangement was something other than what it really was. It was 1513, and Jorge Alvarez, a Portuguese merchant explorer, arrived in the waters near the mouth of the Pearl River with a flotilla of approximately 3 to 5 ships. Historical sources differ on the exact number. Some say 3, others say 5. But the point is, it was a tiny force. These weren't massive warships. They were adapted trading junks, perhaps with a few small cannons, carrying maybe 200 men total. Compared to Zheng He's fleets that had sailed these same waters a century earlier with 300 ships and 30,000 men, the Portuguese expedition was pathetic in scale. But they had something Zheng He hadn't needed: desperation. Portugal in 1513 was a small nation with enormous ambitions. They had just established a maritime route around Africa to India. In 1510, they captured Goa. In 1511, they captured Malacca, the most important trading center in Southeast Asia. Now they wanted the grand prize: direct access to Chinese trade. From Malacca, they had heard about China, about its exquisite silks, its porcelain that Europeans couldn't replicate, its tea, its spices. Merchants in Malacca spoke of China as a fabulously wealthy empire, but also mysteriously closed. Unlike the Southeast Asian kingdoms that traded freely with whoever arrived, China had a controlled tributary system where foreign trade was regulated, restricted, ritualized. The Portuguese wanted into that system, or more precisely, wanted to break it and trade on their own terms. When Alvarez and his ships arrived near Canton in 1513, they caused an immediate sensation. Local fishermen and coastal merchants had never seen Europeans. These foreigners were tall, pale, bearded, wore strange clothes, spoke an incomprehensible language. Their ships were different from Chinese junks, with square sails instead of bamboo mat sails. And most terrifyingly, they had weapons that made terrifying explosions. The Portuguese fired arquebuses and small cannons as a demonstration of power, and the noise frightened local Chinese who, although they had invented gunpowder centuries earlier, hadn't developed firearms as advanced as the European ones. News of these strange foreigners quickly reached local officials. The mandarins responsible for the coastal region sent reports to the capital, describing the arrival of Folangji, the Chinese term for Portuguese, derived from Franks. The reports were confused and alarmed. Who were these foreigners? Where did they come from? Were they traders or pirates, tributaries or invaders? Alvarez attempted to trade with local merchants, exchanging silver and European goods for silk and porcelain. The trade was successful, profitable for both sides. Chinese merchants wanted Portuguese silver, which was minted in good quality coins. The Portuguese wanted Chinese silk, which they could resell in Europe at massive profits. It was a mutually beneficial exchange. But there was a problem. It was illegal under Chinese law. The Ming government had strict regulations on foreign trade. Foreigners were supposed to come as tributary embassies, follow specific rituals, trade at designated times and places. They couldn't just show up and start trading with whomever they wanted. The Portuguese ignored or didn't understand these regulations. They thought they were doing normal commerce. Chinese officials saw this as smuggling by barbarians who didn't respect the law. Alvarez departed after a few weeks, but he had established contact. The Portuguese now knew how to reach China, and that trade was possible. The following year, in 1514, Portugal sent a more ambitious mission commanded by Jorge de Mascarenhas, with instructions to establish formal relations with the Chinese government. This flotilla was larger, perhaps 8 to 10 ships, carrying several hundred men. They arrived in Canton and demanded audience with authorities to discuss trade. Local mandarins were in a quandary. On one hand, these foreigners were annoying, didn't follow protocol, caused disruption. On the other hand, the trade was profitable, and local officials could take bribes to look the other way. So they allowed some unofficial trade while sending reports to Beijing asking what to do. But then in 1517, Portugal made a massive mistake that almost ended their presence in China before it began. They sent an official embassy led by Tomé Pires, a pharmacist turned diplomat, with instructions to go to Beijing and establish formal diplomatic relations with the emperor. The embassy arrived in Canton with 8 warships as escort. This was a respectable fleet by Portuguese standards, large enough to intimidate, but not large enough to conquer. Pires demanded to be taken to Beijing to present letters from King Manuel I of Portugal to the Emperor of China. After much deliberation and considerable bribery, Chinese officials agreed. Pires and a small delegation traveled to Beijing in 1520. But while waiting for audience in the capital, disastrous news arrived from Southeast Asia. Merchants from Malacca and Siam sent reports to the Ming government describing Portuguese atrocities. They said the Portuguese had captured Malacca through treachery and massacre, that they were kidnapping Chinese children in Southeast Asia to sell as slaves, that their merchants were actually pirates in disguise, and crucially, that they had established fortresses and were attempting to monopolize trade by force. These accusations had enough truth. The Portuguese had captured Malacca brutally in 1511, killing thousands. They really did participate in slave trading. They really did use military force to control trade routes. Their model in Asia was aggressive, violent, imperialistic. The Chinese from Malacca who had lived there for generations were expelled or killed by the Portuguese. Naturally, they sent reports to China warning about these dangerous foreigners. The Ming court was outraged. Emperor Zhengde had died, and the new Emperor Jiajing was young and conservative, strongly influenced by Confucian mandarins who distrusted foreigners anyway. The decision was quick and harsh. Expel all Portuguese, arrest Pires' embassy, ban all trade with these barbarian pirates. Tomé Pires was arrested. His mission was rejected. He was sent back to Canton in disgrace, and according to most accounts, died in prison there, though some sources say he was executed. The emperor issued edicts in 1522, banning all trade with Portuguese and ordering coastal officials to repel them by force if they attempted to land. It seemed the Portuguese adventure in China had ended in complete disaster after less than a decade. But here's what saved the Portuguese: the vast distance between imperial edicts issued in Beijing and reality on the Chinese coast. China is enormous. The coastline is long, impossible to patrol effectively with the resources the Ming government had available. Local officials were frequently corrupt, more interested in enriching themselves through bribes than enforcing imperial policy. And Chinese merchants, particularly those involved in maritime trade, desperately wanted Portuguese silver. The Ming economy in the 16th century increasingly ran on silver as a medium of exchange, but China produced relatively little silver domestically. Demand vastly exceeded supply. So, when the Portuguese showed up with ships full of Spanish silver from America and Japanese silver, offering to trade for silk and porcelain, Chinese merchants found ways to trade with them despite official prohibitions. So, a pattern developed that would last for decades, illegal but tolerated trade. The Portuguese established temporary bases on various small islands off the Canton coast. They bribed local officials who were officially suppressing them, but unofficially taking payments to look the other way. They traded with Chinese pirates who were operating outside the law anyway. It was dirty, dangerous, unstable, but it was profitable. The Portuguese brought silver. The Chinese brought silk and porcelain. Both sides made money, and local officials took their cut. This informal arrangement continued from the 1520s to the 1550s, over 30 years of black market trade. The Portuguese repeatedly tried to obtain official permission to establish a permanent factory, but Beijing always refused. So they operated in limbo, never sure if they'd be expelled, but too profitable for local officials to really suppress. And then in 1553 or 1557, sources differ on the exact date the breakthrough occurred. The Portuguese obtained permission to establish themselves on a small peninsula near Canton called Macau. The exact circumstances are disputed and revealing of how ambiguous this arrangement was. The official Portuguese version, the one taught in Portuguese schools for centuries, claimed that Chinese officials, grateful for Portuguese help in suppressing pirates plaguing the coast, granted Macau to Portugal as reward. According to this narrative, the Portuguese were heroes who had protected China from criminals, and Macau was their just reward. The Chinese version tells a different story. They claim the Portuguese simply bribed corrupt local officials and occupied Macau without proper permission from the central government, that it wasn't a grant but a usurpation, that China never ceded sovereignty over Macau but simply allowed the Portuguese to live there as temporary tenants. Which version is true? Probably both contain elements of truth. There were Japanese pirates, known as woku, who really did plague the Chinese coast in the 1550s. They were mainly smugglers and bandits, some Japanese but many Chinese operating from bases in Japan. The Portuguese, with their arquebuses and naval artillery, were effective against these pirates. There are records of Portuguese helping Chinese forces in anti-piracy operations. So the Portuguese story of helping against pirates has some factual basis. But it's also true that the Portuguese bribed extensively. They paid gifts to local officials. They paid rental fees for the right to occupy Macau. And crucially, the central government in Beijing never issued a formal edict granting Macau to Portugal. There was no treaty, no written agreement recognized by both sides as legally binding. That's not all. The ambiguity of how the Portuguese obtained Macau would set the tone for the next 4 centuries. Part 2. What makes the Portuguese establishment in Macau so fascinating is that both sides maintained contradictory fictions about what had actually happened. Portugal claimed Macau was Portuguese territory, that they had complete sovereignty, that it was a colony equal to Goa or Brazil. China claimed Macau remained Chinese territory, that the Portuguese were simply temporary tenants living there by imperial permission, that the arrangement could be revoked at any time. Both claims couldn't be true simultaneously, but both sides pretended they were because the arrangement was mutually beneficial. Portugal got its trading base in China. China got a safety valve for trade that its own laws prohibited, but its economy needed. And the ambiguity meant each side could save face. Let's look at how this worked in practice. When the Portuguese first settled in Macau in the 1550s, it was a small, practically uninhabited peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus. The total population was maybe a few hundred Chinese fishermen. The Portuguese began to build. They raised defensive walls, built churches, established a town hall, constructed warehouses and docks. By the 1580s, Macau had several thousand Portuguese residents, plus a much larger Chinese population working as laborers, servants, traders. It was becoming a real city, not just a temporary trading factory, and the Portuguese governed it as Portuguese territory. They established a senate, town council, appointed a governor, enforced Portuguese law, collected taxes, all without consulting Chinese authorities. But simultaneously, they paid annual rent to Chinese officials in Canton. This rent was initially 500 taels of silver per year, a modest sum that became symbolic rather than onerous as Macau's wealth grew. Why would they pay rent if they claimed complete sovereignty? Because they pragmatically recognized that without Chinese cooperation, Macau was unsustainable. All their drinking water came from the mainland. All their food came from China. Their supply of silk and porcelain for trade depended on access to Chinese markets. If China decided to cut off Macau completely, close the isthmus, stop all trade, the Portuguese wouldn't last months. So they paid the rent, calling it a gift or tribute to pretend it was voluntary, but everyone knew it was the price of staying. On the Chinese side, Ming authorities allowed the Portuguese to govern themselves internally while maintaining control over what mattered: access. There were gates at the isthmus where Chinese officials inspected all people and goods entering or leaving Macau. The Chinese maintained a military garrison nearby, not in Macau itself, but close enough to intervene if the Portuguese caused trouble. And crucially, the Portuguese were never allowed to establish control over the surrounding territory. Macau was a small peninsula, maybe 3 square kilometers. The Portuguese couldn't expand inland, couldn't annex neighboring islands, couldn't build fortifications outside the defined territory. This meant Macau was simultaneously Portuguese territory and completely dependent on Chinese tolerance. It was conditional sovereignty, and the condition was acceptable behavior. This ambiguous interdependence created a stable system for one simple reason: both sides gained too much from the arrangement to risk destroying it. For Portugal, Macau became the key to their Asian trade. It was the only port where the Portuguese had permanent access to Chinese markets. From Macau, the Portuguese organized the lucrative triangular trade. They brought silver from America and Japan to Macau, exchanged it for Chinese silk and porcelain, took the silk to Japan to exchange for more silver, and brought Chinese goods back to Europe via the Cape route. The profits were astronomical. Merchants who survived the round trip often retired wealthy. Macau generated massive revenue for the Portuguese crown through taxes and tariffs. It was one of the jewels of the Portuguese Empire. For China, Macau solved both an ideological and practical problem. Ideologically, orthodox Confucianism disapproved of foreign trade, especially trade with barbarians. Conservative mandarins argued that China was self-sufficient, that it needed nothing from foreigners, that trade promoted greed and corrupted morality. But pragmatically, the Chinese economy needed silver. Chinese merchants wanted to trade. Having the Portuguese confined to Macau allowed China to benefit from trade while maintaining the fiction that foreigners weren't really in China, just in a small peripheral exception. It was a safety valve that prevented the need to officially reform trade policies. The government could claim it was maintaining traditional restrictions while allowing trade to flourish in Macau. But this delicate balance was tested repeatedly over the following centuries. The first major challenge came when the Ming dynasty collapsed in 1644 and was replaced by the Qing dynasty, founded by Manchu invaders from the north. The civil war that accompanied this transition was catastrophic. A Chinese warlord named Zheng Chenggong, known in the West as Koxinga, who was resisting the Qing, controlled the southern coasts for years. Zheng had his own massive fleet and basically ran a pirate state from bases in Fujian. The Portuguese in Macau had to navigate carefully, trading with whoever controlled the region at any given time, paying protection to multiple warlords, trying to stay neutral in the conflict. The Qing eventually defeated Zheng, but not before his forces attacked Macau in 1622, killed several Portuguese, and demonstrated how vulnerable the enclave really was. Once the Qing consolidated control, they initially considered expelling the Portuguese as punishment for having traded with Ming remnants. But they decided against this because Macau remained useful. The Qing, though foreign Manchu conquerors, adopted Ming administrative structures and many policies, including restrictions on foreign trade. So they also found Macau useful as a safety valve. They renewed the arrangement. The Portuguese could stay as long as they paid rent, didn't cause trouble, and accepted Chinese restrictions on their activities. The restrictions became stricter under the Qing. In 1717, Emperor Kangxi issued edicts prohibiting Chinese from Christianizing, which had been a major missionary activity from Macau. In 1757, Emperor Qianlong implemented the Canton system. which restricted all European foreign trade to a single port canton and to a single set of sanctioned merchants, the Cohong. Macau technically wasn't part of this system because it was its own special space, but in practice, Portuguese merchants still had to go to Canton to do major business, making Macau more a residential area than a primary trading hub. During this period, from the 17th to 19th centuries, Macau developed a unique culture that was neither completely Portuguese nor completely Chinese, but a fascinating fusion. The population was mostly Chinese, but with a significant Portuguese overlay. The Portuguese brought Catholicism, and you can still see beautiful Baroque churches in Macau today, including the ruins of St. Paul's, the facade of a 17th century cathedral destroyed by fire in 1835, but never rebuilt. The Portuguese introduced European architecture, colonial-style buildings with arcades, public squares, forts with bastions, but they also adopted many Chinese practices. Many Portuguese married Chinese women, creating a mixed population of Macanese with their own Creole language called Patois that mixed Portuguese, Cantonese, Malay. Macau cuisine became a fusion of Portuguese, Chinese, and Southeast Asian influence, creating dishes that existed nowhere else. But the 19th century would bring crises that threatened Macau's continued existence. The Opium Wars between Britain and China, 1839, 1842 and 1856, 1860, fundamentally transformed the balance of power in East Asia. Britain, using overwhelming military superiority, forced China to open multiple ports to trade, cede Hong Kong, pay massive indemnities, and accept extraterritoriality. Suddenly, Macau was no longer the only place where Europeans could trade with China. Hong Kong, just 65 kilometers to the east, became the main British trading base. Shanghai, Canton, Ningbo, Fuzhou all were opened. Merchants relocated to these new ports, where regulations were looser and opportunities greater. Macau entered an economic decline from which it would never fully recover. Portugal, watching other European powers carve out concessions in China, decided to formalize its control over Macau. In 1849, Portuguese Governor João Ferreira do Amaral unilaterally declared that Macau was sovereign Portuguese territory, stopped paying the annual rent to China, and expelled Chinese customs officials who had operated in Macau. This was a flagrant violation of the ambiguous arrangement that had existed for 3 centuries. Qing authorities were furious, but also powerless. They were dealing with the Taiping Rebellion, the bloodiest civil war in human history, and couldn't divert resources to retake Macau. Local Chinese merchants, however, took revenge. On August 22, 1849, Amaral was ambushed and killed, his head cut off and displayed publicly. Portugal retaliated with military force, capturing the gates at the isthmus and expanding territory under Portuguese control. Qing authorities protested but didn't intervene militarily. Macau's ambiguous status was being resolved by force toward de facto Portuguese sovereignty. In 1887, Portugal and China finally signed a treaty, the Lisbon Protocol, that supposedly clarified Macau's status. China recognized the perpetual occupation and government of Macau by Portugal. In exchange, Portugal agreed it would never cede Macau to another power without Chinese consent. This was the first formal agreement between China and Portugal about Macau, 330 years after the Portuguese had settled there. But even this treaty was ambiguous. The phrase, perpetual occupation and government, wasn't the same as sovereignty. Chinese diplomats argued that China still retained ultimate sovereignty, that the treaty only recognized Portuguese administration, not ownership. The Portuguese argued it meant complete sovereignty. The ambiguity persisted. During the 20th century, Macau became a backwater. While Hong Kong prospered as a major trading and financial hub, Macau languished. Its main industry became gambling. Casinos were legalized in Macau in the 1850s, when they were still illegal in most places. By the mid-20th century, Macau was known as the Monte Carlo of the Orient, attracting gamblers from Hong Kong and beyond. But it was a sordid prosperity, associated with organized crime, money laundering, and prostitution. The population was mostly Chinese, and increasingly, even the Portuguese governing elite felt they were administering a territory that was culturally Chinese that happened to be under the Portuguese flag. During World War II, Macau remained neutral. Portugal was officially neutral in And Japan, although it occupied neighboring China, respected Macau's neutrality perhaps because it wasn't worth the effort to capture, perhaps because it was useful as a neutral point for diplomacy and intelligence. Macau's population grew massively when Chinese refugees fled from the Japanese into the relative safety of Portuguese territory. After the communists took China in 1949, the continued existence of Portuguese Macau became even more anomalous. China under Mao could have easily taken Macau. Portugal was weak, distant, couldn't defend it. But China chose not to. Why? Pragmatic reasons. Macau, like Hong Kong, was useful as a window to the outside world. During the Cold War, when China was mostly isolated, Macau provided connection to global trade. Also, taking Macau by force would have frightened Hong Kong, which was economically much more important. And perhaps more fundamentally, China adopted a policy of long patience regarding territories it saw as historically Chinese. Rather than reconquer by force, they would wait until circumstances allowed negotiated recovery on their terms. This policy eventually succeeded. In 1974, Portugal underwent the Carnation Revolution, a military coup that overthrew the long-standing dictatorship and established democracy. The new Portuguese government, influenced by anti-colonial ideals, immediately began decolonizing. Portuguese Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau was freed quickly. Portugal also offered to return Macau to China, but surprisingly, China refused. Why? Because China was still under Mao, still in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, and wasn't ready for the transition. They told Portugal to wait, that the time would come, but not yet. So Macau continued as a Portuguese colony by decision of both sides. It wasn't until 1987, after Mao had died and China had begun reforms under Deng Xiaoping, that China and Portugal signed the joint declaration agreeing to the transfer of Macau to China in 1999. On December 20th, 1999, in a ceremony in Macau, Portugal finally returned the territory to China. 442 years after the Portuguese had settled there, they left. Macau became a special administrative region of China, guaranteed one country, two systems, with a high degree of autonomy for 50 years until 2049. The handover ceremony was elegant and melancholic. The Portuguese governor gave an emotional speech about shared history. The Portuguese flag was lowered, the Chinese flag raised. Delegation after delegation of Macanese. The mixed population of Portuguese-Chinese descent wept, feeling the end of an era. The Portuguese presence that had lasted almost half a millennium had ended not through conquest or war, but through peaceful negotiation. Portugal had maintained a colony in China longer than any other European power, outliving the British, French, German, Russian, Dutch empires, all of which lost their Chinese concessions decades earlier. And here's the final irony of Macau's story. Portugal never really took Macau in the sense of conquering it militarily. They infiltrated, bribed, made themselves useful, persisted, and gradually solidified their presence during circumstances where China was weak or distracted or found the arrangement convenient. But China never completely surrendered its claim that Macau was Chinese territory. Even when Portugal exercised effective government, even when treaties recognized Portuguese administration, China maintained that ultimately Macau would return. And they were right. The 442 years of Portuguese rule were, from China's long-duration perspective, a temporary aberration. The 3 to 5 ships that arrived in 1513 began a presence that lasted almost half a millennium. But they were there by Chinese permission, sufficiently tolerated, never fully accepted, always provisional. When China finally decided the arrangement had lasted long enough, it ended. Not with violence, but with negotiation. Not with humiliation, but with dignity. But it ended absolutely. The Portuguese left. Macau became Chinese again. And the longest and strangest story of European colonization in Asia came to its close, ending a chapter that had begun when 3 small ships sailed into Chinese waters almost 5 centuries ago, carrying merchants who had no idea they were starting a presence that would outlast their own empires.